in a developing economy like India. This session, we would be discussing and having a discourse on inclusiveness and development strategies. We have with us the prominent personality in gender economics and development economics, Dr. Mridu Leepan, Honorary Fellow at the Center for Development Studies and the former member of Kerala State Planning Board to chair the session. A hearty welcome to you, ma'am. We also have with us the prolific speaker, Professor R. Ramkumar, from the School of Development Studies, TISS, Mumbai, to address us on microfinance for the poor in India. I extend a hearty welcome to Professor R. Ramkumar to this event. We have two presentations in this session. I warmly welcome Dr. Manju S. Nair, Head Department of Economics, University of Kerala, and Mr. Siddiq Rabia, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, University of Kerala, for the same. Finally, with immense pleasure, I welcome all the academicians, scholars and students gathered here. Welcome you all once again. Thank you.
I request Mridu ma'am to start the proceedings.
I think let's start immediately because we are running almost half an hour late. So the pattern is going to be the main speaker for half an hour and the other two speakers for 15 minutes each, and we'll try to have about 20 minutes of discussion. That's the present pattern. Let's see how it goes. Now let me just have a quick 2-minute introduction. One is that I am really happy to be here in this session, so I'm actually substituting for someone else, but still I feel it's a big honor to me because I feel this whole project of the Indian University Center for Alternative Economics is a very, very exciting project. And I think it has, as I was mentioning, and as I think it's been advised by everybody, it has to be taken very seriously, not just thinking of neoclassical economics, but for all other types of economics which actually did come in the sense of Amartya Sen's development economics or the institutional economics, how much we can take from them, or what are the alternatives that we have in mind. So to have the alternatives in mind, we should be very thorough with what has been happening in the field of economics, whether neoclassical or whether some of the improvements, or rather improvements in the sense of addressing reality much more, was being undertaken by so many people. Now, what is the theme of this session? It's inclusiveness. And I think this is probably the most challenging of all the analysis that we can think of in terms of challenging conventional macroeconomic analysis. Because macroeconomic analysis and policy has been actually a complete disjuncture with social policy. And there is need to integrate macroeconomic policy with social policy. I think that is the most important thing, because not only because of globalization and its aggressive impact on the poorer people and the whole issue of social exclusion that we talk about, even in the earlier state-led industrialization processes, because development was supposed to trickle down to each and everybody, social policy was treated as a residual. So if people are not included in the process of development, what little tinkering can we do for those sections of people who have not been able to gain from development? So social policy has always been treated as an add-on to macroeconomic policy. But what the challenge is, may I now ask Siddiq? Paper presentation.
About one of you. Good afternoon all. Chair, Professor Mridu Leepan, Professor Ramkumar, Dr. Manju S. Nair, dignitaries on the dais, and friends. So actually I have a dilemma, in fact, to present what? Because it is a long paper. It is having two aspects. One is the theoretical concern and the second one is an empirical concern. So I would like to actually stick upon the theoretical to the conceptual concern. So that was actually I finalized today. So I am going to speak strictly in this slide because otherwise I may not be actually running out of time. So in the outset, the development. Now the development is actually the theme of the thing, and it's people who's already mentioned about the relevance of macroeconomic interaction or any other significant sort of thinking other than the neoclassical thing. So I would like to actually mention or start from neoclassical approach itself. So in the neoclassical approach, property right under the zero transaction cost is perfect, right? This is what actually Ronald Coase, the Nobel laureate in institutional economics, he was actually referring. Under a positive transaction cost, these perfect property rights may become shaky. This is what the argument, and I would like to actually share some of the discomfort in the neoclassical tradition and to see how we can actually have an interventionist or affirmative action based on the judiciary based or any sort of institution based system. So what are the rationale of making such an interpretation of right under zero transaction, zero and positive transaction costs, and what are the implications of this logical inference under the political situation? These questions are in fact pertinent to us, and that is what I am going to actually do today. So in the neoclassical view on a transaction cost and property right, where we have we classify the neoclassical view as two. One is property right under zero transaction cost, and the other one is property right under positive transaction cost. Property rights under zero transaction cost is earlier view of the exchange, where a property right is considered as given or perfect. This means that the neoclassical economics do not consider the cost of obtaining information about alternative and of negotiating, policing and enforcing economic exchange. Such costs are zero under a market situation where the cost of information is perfect among the players. In a similar way, they were of the view that the allocation of property right is perfect due to the cost of information and other cost of establishing and maintaining property right remain zero. So this could be help us to derive property rights transaction cost relation as they follow, which is non-conventional economic graph, where you have actually two sides, transaction cost on the other side and the property right on the. If your transaction cost is zero, as per Ronald Coase said, then you have actually a perfect property right. Of course, I have dispute on this. And then if you move on having a positive transaction cost, then you maybe actually have. So this is actually the difference, or what you can say the trade-off. So the early neoclassical view of the sort is built on the rationality of perfect information among the players. This information will give way to the doctrine of perfect competition with its guiding principles of profit maximizing behavior of individuals. However, this has been questioned. For example, consider the compatibility of information and competition. Now let's what is actually competition? If two or more individuals, which is actually n is greater than 2, offer independent value, which is P, of securing a commodity X from a third person T. That is a race for securing X from T by A or B. So this is actually, in a simple way, we call a competition. It also implies that there is no cooperation in securing X from T. So that is non-cooperative. The system is actually perceived in a non-cooperative framework. And what is information symmetry on the other side? It in a neoclassical frame, how can we define is the following, that is, as Oman defined, that is, I know that what you know and you know that what I know. So we can extend that argument ever. So in other words, information is of A is equal to B, which implies that B has all the characteristics which A has and vice versa. So if on commodity and price the same follows as the follower. So what would be the nature of competition then? Two possibilities which you can derive out of it. A, the competition with equal entitlement, and B, the competition with unequal entitlement. So what is the ultimate effect in that basic premise? The perfect competition with the symmetric information produces for the static result. And I will come to what does it mean. Under such a circumstance, does property right better perfect or imperfect matters? So why it's so? So these are the questions which we need to, and along with that, such a notion seems to be puzzling or more formally to say logical topology. So why it's so? Because the resource, the possible conclusion is that because the resource transfer and its consumption take place simultaneously, or to say this does not consider the direction of the use of resources either ex ante or ex post, which is actually timeless. This is the greatest criticism which is raised against this idea, which is actually the microeconomic framework is timeless. So neoclassic with the transaction laws on the other side, they are actually putting a different notion. That is, the real-world theoretical model characterized by the information asymmetry is quite unrealistic and little to do with any policy decisions, whereas in a later stage, this asymmetric information theory gained its momentum. I'm not actually going to the reviews, and the rationality question is addressed in this term, modeling bounded rationality and limited rationality as the key factor in behavior which drives the economic decisions. However, the consideration of the concept of bounded and limited rationality is still carrying over the neoclassical hangover in economic modeling. This is what this is an important critique which we need to basically look at. So then the neoclassical economics is of the view that the transportation cost is the only cost accrued other than the cost of production due to the entire cost of production and exchange. This is how they are actually perceived. Of course, Arrow and many economists of the mainstream, they argue very vehemently on this, and under perfectly informed will, the possibility of any cost other than the cost of transportation is impossible. This is what their argument. And the concept of transportation cost is inevitable and rationalizable because the production site and the consumption sites are two different locations or two different entities. To realize the interaction of the economic process of exchange, these two have to come together and do the business. So this is actually the unintegrated firm where they used to say we have actually disintegrated or actually not integrated market, non-integrated market, which is market A to N, and in individual or firm is having interaction, then you have definitely a transaction cost. Then the solution is the firm, you integrate the firm. So if you horizontally or vertically integrate, then the problem will be solved. But that is not actually the concern. The view is perhaps classical because it may be better than the no transaction cost view, hence transportation cost may bring the resources loss incurred due to the imperfect information or opportunism or running of the economic system as it defined. But the transportation cost definition of the transaction cost is problematic to represent the property rights creation under its conceptualization, because the transportation cost cannot etymologically coherent to accumulate many costs such as establishment of right over the resources or the enforcement cost of exercising rights or the search cost of looking for a market. Similarly, themselves note that without recognizing the cost of establishing property right or ownership and the possession of resources to exchange, the whole process of transaction seems to be unrealistic. Now, if you look at the property right from a transaction cost as as earlier mentioned premise, then the important constraints to understand the transaction cost is its complexity to minimize invisible cost. This implies that a positive relationship between the property right assignment and transaction cost. So, which is actually a departure from what I proposed earlier, and then transaction cost as the cost of establishing and maintaining property right. To dissect this definition, it has two parts: A, creating a right over a resource which is a necessary condition, and protecting it from appropriation, which is a sufficient condition. So this definition is obviously different from the cost, zero transaction cost world and having property right. So it is actually now going to be the reverse of the same. That is actually if you have a high, if you want to have a perfect property rights, then you have to have a very high transaction cost mode, and if you have imperfection in property right, it can goes to zero, then no problem. This relationship is crucial because it ignites the central question of what makes the distribution of property right and the rationale of positive transaction cost in the process of any exchange under any social order. Similarly, the distribution of property right is dependent on who bears the cost of transaction or transaction, hence determining the value. This also uses the portion of such cost is either sunken or irretrievable, which often makes the transaction cost beyond minimizing it into zero, and it also not advocating any particular set of property right regimes such as private property right or only property right and so on. This approach is having compatibility with viscosity from establishing property right which need further elaboration but not attempting at this point. And in a nutshell, the property right transaction cost relation can accumulate a spectrum of property right regime than simply advocating any particular system as a best or efficient. What I want to actually say that, this is actually the theoretical premise I set down. Now, For example, in the development discourse in the first day, we have actually used that Kerala had actually achieved the development from those lecture onwards. The discussion is actually centered on that, and that is mentioning that you have actually better education status, health status on all the thing. Now, if you have a property question, I have actually two anecdotes to make. One is actually Royal Proclamation, maybe it is actually in 1870, or later it is actually done by the Swadhi Tirunal. And the motivation that, if you have a declaration like if you have actually education as actually entitled to the citizens of Travancore. So it is actually acted as an institution which is basically later ignited many to argue for. And it is later in 1860s and 70s and 80s and 90s legitimized many of the maybe struggles to basically get education, and hence since the Royal Proclamation is actually entitled the rights to every citizen, that is the clause, that every citizen needs to be constitutional right, then that is in fact entitled the citizens to basically argue for, irrespective of their caste, irrespective of their class characteristics. So that is one sort. And if I am particular about the property issue, then from 60s on, 1860s onwards, only you have private property started, not elsewhere. For example, you cannot actually, no property is basically purely privately owned, it is actually state owned. Now, you cannot actually even fell a tree without the permission of the state. So this had actually given, that private rights had actually given from 1870s, 80s, 90s. And that in fact actually made people have not pure private, actually functional rights. So I have actually point. So if there is any question, which is actually entitled people to have investment on other sectors, which is some point is actually held as an institution where you have affirmative action led and the coexistence of people's reaction on that. And that is actually in my mind has led a sort of, because it's a large story, I don't want to actually mess up the story if you have this one. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that the presentation went over. So actually it is not like that actually. The premise which I was setting the entire discussion is normally in the very typical neoclassical theory, we list all the other elements from society out. You make your model and you try to explain things, but basically that is incoherent. In order to in order to explain the real world or whatever the intent is or whatever the reality, you have to reconstruct your model. You have to, in that, you have to actually bring different things into. In that, actually endeavor, the institutional economics emerged, then law and economics emerged, many sub-disciplines emerged. In that outset, what I tried is actually the institution, for example, the law or any sort of any legal affirmation or statement, that itself, that is actually it is non-individual. It is actually not a particular individual. It's actually from the state or some third party. This is actually called the third party intervention. Now, my point is actually, if you have third party interventions, then you have actually a different economics. And that different economics cannot be basically explained by the traditional economics, where you have to reconstruct your model. And that is actually the premise which I spoke about, the entire thing. Because, for instance, if you want to basically speak about development, and we always try to speak about the outcomes, but the premises of that outcome has to be basically evaluated. And it has to be basically connected, and it has to be theorized. So in that context only my point makes some relevance and some sense, otherwise it doesn't. Because in the original neoclassical model, where as I refer, that it never speaks about any rights, any sort of thing. But that is not the case in reality. If you have some sort of right in terms of, for example, use right, or you have to actually make use of the resource. We speak about transaction of commodity or transaction of right. We only speak about transaction of commodity, but we never speak about transaction of rights. Because transaction of commodity itself preceded by rights, which is actually an institution. So you have to actually have a hell lot of complexity which is actually involved before even you just get into the very idea of transaction. But that is actually out of your context, and in that context only, so that is actually brings positive cost in the society, positive. I have actually not put myself completely out of the neoclassical. What I was actually in the presentation, I was stood within the neoclassical sense, and then I said that what is actually the discomfort, which in order to explain the empirical world. So that is the first part of the story, and that is the thing. Then you can actually, then only you can basically explain the real world and go back to the empirics and theorize what is actually the real empirics looks like. Not from the neoclassical, typical neoclassical theory, which is actually completely fails to basically explain whatever real world empiricism is.
So we've really just one or two things I wanted to say, which one was that this public SHG bank linkage, where the public sector banks are playing an important role. Now, though the way you put it, of course, it's much above the private thing, but in Kerala, the Kudumbashree groups are facing the problem of not being able to access loans from these banks. So that's one thing which you have to keep in mind, that the banks themselves may be driven by the financial deregulation type of a thing, but they're not. So that's one thing you should keep in mind. And the other thing which I wanted to say was that was a basic question. I don't want you to answer it now. But can we agree to selling off bits of land because somebody is able to pay the price which you estimate in terms of all your ecological system of goods and services? Can one then say, okay, so long as Shobha is able to pay all that, maybe they are entitled to take that land. So that is one thing which is probably what was worrying her, and what always keeps worrying me, that if Sri Sri Ravi Shankar was able to pay that price, he didn't even pay that, and he was able to do all that. But of course his devotees all tell me that the Ganga looks much better now than the Yamuna. The Yamuna looks much better now. And the other thing, of course, is of all these big corporates who are now defaulting. I mean, nobody talks about that as much as catching hold of these poor self-help group wala women who are not able to repay their loans and have to commit suicide. But nothing much is happening to the big defaulters which now are coming up. So these are certain things which we have to keep in mind in the alternative. That what do we do about these big defaulters? How do we catch them? And what do we do about helping out the poor women who are really not able to pay perhaps interest for a few months? So thank you very much for a very interesting session, and thank you for the organizers for asking me to chair this session. Thanks a lot. The session is over and lunch is served outside.
I would like to call upon Anamika to propose a vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. The last and final section is over, and it's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. And firstly, I would like to thank Madam Mridul Ethel for effectively chairing the session and ensuring the time limits. Thank you, ma'am. Professor R. Ramkumar for showing the important space microfinance have in changing the poor in India and aptly pointing out the model which will actually help us in sending the poor to the museum. Thank you, sir. Over to the museum. And our dear Manjuha for her important work and sharing with us your findings and opinions today on the urgent need for an alternative methodology in assessing the cost of development-induced environmental disposition. Thank you, ma'am. And Siddhi sir, we all know every day he comes with a package of new ideas and thoughts on different fields of economics. Since we are not able to thank him after the regular classes for the brain exercise he's given, I use this opportunity to thank him for his enthusiasm and finally for the energetic participation of all of you. And as ma'am said, time is served, and I request you to be present here on 2 p.m. to attend the 2:30 p.m. to attend the panel discussion on the necessity of development alternative. Thank you.